Bulavanakana, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, Professor McCallum, Professor Kroc, Ms. Massey, distinguished delegates. I do not want to give a formal speech, but would like to highlight that, just make a few comments in respect of what has happened in Fiji over the past few years. I think it all started off, the prominence really in the public space that came into being was when we decided to have the new Fijian constitution, the 2013 constitution, translated into the Braille language. That had never happened before in Fiji, and indeed I'm told that many countries in the world do not have their constitutions translated in the Braille language. We saw it as a very critical decision, essentially to ensure that all Fijians, or as many Fijians as possible, had access to the supreme law of the land. And that, we think, is very, very important, not just simply for people to be able to read it, but to actually help them, empower them, or to empower them to know what are the rules, the laws that actually govern them on a day-to-day basis. Or indeed, what is the supreme law that gives rise to other laws within the land. That, I think, was a very critical turning point, because it brought home the point and indeed put in the public domain the importance of ensuring that we involve people who what we consider handicapped, disabled, or people see them as non-functioning members of the community, and to mainstream them and help everybody else understand that these people are just as important as anybody else. We of course had the Braille Constitution not just in the English language but also in the Itauke language. We have given a commissioning to an institute in India to have it translated in Hindi. Of course, many people in Fiji do not read traditional Sanskrit-based Hindi, but the fact is a lot more people do read it in English and also in the Itauke language. So we have those two critical languages in the Braille language. Now, what then subsequently obviously was the most critical thing was, what does the supreme law of the land say about persons with disabilities? And again, for the first time, we had the supreme law of Fiji actually having specific rights under Section 42 of the Constitution, talking about the rights of persons with disabilities. Now, it of course involves the ability to have administrative reforms, of having different languages, whether it's sign language, whether it's Braille language available, to give persons with disabilities that access to those rights that they would otherwise would not have enjoyed if you do not have these specific provisions. It of course requires things like, for example, adaptations of public transportation, public buildings, etc. What is critically important also that many people do not necessarily realize is that in the 2013 Fijian Constitution, the rights are not just vertically applicable, but it's also horizontally applicable. In other words, these are rights that are not just simply enforceable against the state, but also it's enforceable against other actors within the state. So previously we had, for example, the previous constitution in Fiji had a limitation where the Bill of Rights, in fact, was limited to an enforcement against only the state, so what you call a vertical application. Now, of course, it's applicable across on a horizontal basis against other private actors within the state itself. So you could, for example, have it enforced against clubs, associations, various private corporations, etc., where these Bill of Rights are enforceable against those actors too. Subsequently, as you know, as has already been mentioned, the government then had made a commitment, both in 2010 and also in 2014, in Geneva, that the Fijian government would ratify the 9 core human rights conventions under the UN umbrella. This, of course, includes the UN, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. That convention indeed, as required by law under the Fijian constitution, any convention that is to be ratified needs to be brought before Parliament. It is then referred to the committee that deals with the ratification of conventions, which is generally the Foreign Relations Committee. And so that convention was tabled in Parliament. We understand that the committee will make a recommendation that the convention should be ratified, and therefore it will be brought to the session next year in Parliament, which begins in February, for that particular recommendation of the report by the committee, for it to be debated, and then, God willing, then have the convention ratified, and hopefully we can do that as soon as possible. Now, simultaneously, what government did was also put in place a bill, drafted a bill for persons with disabilities. So it kind of fleshes out many of the provisions within the Constitution itself and the Convention, and puts in place of a domestic law that gives substance to the Convention, and indeed the functioning of the Convention in a practical sense, and the functioning of the provision of the Constitution in a practical sense by way of domestic law. So we are also hoping that that bill will be referred back to Parliament for debate and again for approval by Parliament. So we actually took the approach that we should have both of these sort of running simultaneously, as opposed to waiting for the ratification of the convention and then putting in place a bill, because the Constitution gave us the flexibility to do that, because we already had a Constitution that had many of the core provisions of the convention within our Constitution in any case. So that, ladies and gentlemen, is a sort of a snapshot of the history, the short history and the recent history pertaining to the public positioning of the persons with disabilities and their rights within the legal framework in Fiji. What I would like to comment, though, ladies and gentlemen, I think rights in itself should not be isolated. There needs to be a holistic approach to rights. In Fiji, unfortunately, for a number of decades, there has traditionally only been a focus on civil and political rights. So if you saw the previous constitutions, they had a huge emphasis on civil and political rights. And I think we tended to also have a focus on just ticking on the boxes it was more about form rather than substance. As one would argue that people talk about justice, but what really is of critical importance is substantive justice. So there's no point having provision of civil and political rights, arguably, when you actually may not necessarily be giving it enough finances, or conversely, when you're actually not giving enough or equal emphasis on socioeconomic rights. Many people would argue and say, well, it's well and fine to have civil and political rights, but what about your socioeconomic rights? What about your right to have sanitation, your right to have a roof over your head, your right to be able to have access to food, to water? Unfortunately, I think within the sort of human rights discourse, there has been a general focus on only civil and political rights for a number of decades, and indeed that has always been the focus, to the neglect of socioeconomic rights. So the 2013 Constitution provides that opportunity for us to be able to equally have the focus on civil and political rights and also socioeconomic rights. Previously we had civil and political rights, but we did not necessarily have focus on the rights of persons with disabilities. Nobody talked about ratifying the Convention of Persons with Disabilities. Nobody talked about, for example, as referred to earlier on, about how do disabled people, what will they do when they go to vote? Prior to this new law that we have on the electoral system in Fiji, there was no specific provisions in law, not even in regulations, pertaining to the functions of the Supervisory Elections Office or the Fijian Elections Office as to how they will assist people who are disabled to come and vote. What are the rules when a blind person, for example, comes up to a polling station? What are the rules pertaining to them when they walk in? What's going to happen? We now actually have rules around that. Who can actually go with them to the booth? Who can be the witness? What happens, for example, when the polling station, for example, is on a hill and the person has got a wheelchair, they're on a wheelchair, there's no ramp? What will happen? Can you bring the polling booth down to the car or to the vehicle at the base of the hill? Do the rules allow that? Yes, the rules in Fiji do allow that. And there's obviously, we are looking at ways of refining all those rules. But these are all the sort of rules that did not exist previously. So essentially you found a lot of persons with disabilities who actually did not vote. They did not actually have a say in who was going to govern them. So these things are they may seem like very simple things, but they're very critical things. It also is very empowering when you have people, for example, who are able to feel that notwithstanding their disability, their blindness, their deafness, the inability to walk, etc., or even some form of mental issue, that despite that, they're still being considered part of mainstream society, that despite that, there are certain adjustments have been made, and sometimes they're actually not that expensive. They're not that difficult. You just need to have a sense of wanting to empower people. If you're able to make those adjustments, those people feel extremely empowered. They feel extremely empowered, and therefore their ability to contribute to society is even greatly enhanced. You know, in the past couple of years, I personally have met so many talented people who, what we traditionally would consider disabled and maybe not, non-contributing members of society. But they're fantastic in terms of their intellect, their ability, their craftsmanship, craftswomanship, whatever you may call it. We have today a professor here who is blind from birth. I think in the Pacific, Professor, I would be safe for me to say that nobody here would actually think that you could have an emeritus professor in law who is completely blind. I have met, for example, recently a gentleman who is deaf, but who's doing his master's in computer science. There are many other stories such as that. So our ability to be able to tap into those resources is also very, very important. We have, for example, done some small things in the recent budget that was announced. We have said that we'll give a 300% tax rebate to any employer that employs somebody for 3 years. We have, for example, come across instances of discrimination. In the last budget consultations, for example, we had a gentleman who cannot speak. He uses sign language, and he works in a printing press here in the West. And he does exactly the same type of job, performs exactly the same type of functions that a person, who we consider non-disabled, but they pay him a different wage. When he's sick, they don't pay him sick leave. When he asks for his sick leave, they said, look, you can leave. We don't really need you. But the fact of the matter is, his productivity level, his output, is exactly the same as everybody else. So why is he being discriminated against? So what we are trying to do, there are many other subtle ways in society that we are able to then sort of attract these people, mainstream them, empower them, give them a source of revenue, give them a source of income. They become contributing members of our society, and that's precisely what we want. And they have a great sense of dignity then. People need to fundamentally live with dignity. And I think, as the good professor said, the committee is there, and also as Ms. Masih said, the process is not about the convention or ratification, is not about using a big stick, beating people down, beating countries down. The idea is to recognize what they're doing. The idea is to encourage those countries to see how better they can do it. But also at the same time, to be able to ensure that we don't simply just get driven by the process. We're not simply there to ratify the convention and always just to file reports. The idea is, what is the practical outcome of the ratification of the convention? That is really the key focus. Sometimes I think, different organizations and governments and maybe departments can get carried away with the process per se. But we must look at what are we doing practically on the ground for these people. How are we mainstreaming them? How are we empowering them? And I'm hopeful that in your deliberations, in your workshop, you'll be able to also have some discussions around that, how in some practical sense you can give a lot of meat and substance to the very principal values enshrined in the Constitution. So thank you very much for the invitation. And once again, thank you for the good professors for being here. In fact, I was a bit late because the Honourable Prime Minister has gone off to Australia. So you've come from Australia to Fiji, and he's gone off from Fiji to Australia. But thank you very much for your presence. It does inspire a lot of us. And we also like to thank the UN and the Human Rights Commission for organizing this workshop. And I wish you a good day. Vinaka. Thank you.